Welcome back to the Blue Ridge Breakdown. I am your host, Troy Miller, and I'm really pleased today to not have to do all of the talking and monologuing for some indeterminate amount of time. I am joined today by my friend and former boss, Thom Hartmann, who is America's #1 progressive talk radio host. He is the New York Times best-selling author of 40 some books, 30 or more of which are still in print. You can catch him live from noon to 3 p.m. Eastern time on over hundreds of stations across the country and free speech TV. You can subscribe to his Substack at Hartman Report. I imagine all of this is pretty much a formality for a lot of the people who are listening and tuned in, because I think a lot of you might have come to the Blue Ridge Breakdown through Thom. And he has a new book out today or tomorrow. We're recording this on September 22nd. I think it comes out September 23rd. It is The Last American President, A Broken Man, A Corrupt Party, and a World on the Brink. And first of all, Thom, thank you so much for joining us. And there it is on the screen. I'll keep the gallery view up for the video. Thanks for joining us, Thom. How are you?
Oh, it's great to see you again, Troy. I'm fine, thank you.
It's good to be on this side of the microphone and not have you come up with all of the different things for me, the introduction. But
Well, you
I
used
want
to you
to
used to write a lot of my rants when we were doing television together.
absolutely, and I helped write. I have acknowledgments in 8 of those books, so 30
Yeah,
of which are still in print, and
yeah,
I think we're going to touch on a number of those today because, I mean, I want to talk about the book that's out now. It seems incredibly timely, which is tough to do in this media environment and the way the news cycle moves and everything.
yeah.
But one of the last books I helped write with you was The Hidden History of Big Brother. And with that, a couple of them before that were The Hidden History of Oligarchy in America and The Hidden History of Monopoly in America. And
Mhm.
I think right now, all 3 of those are things that a lot of people are kind of waking up to with the FCC's approach to ABC, with the just rampant just corruption that's going on, and the way that big business seems to have realized that as long as they're loyal, they can get away with murder basically right now. Not that they weren't
Mhm.
getting away with murder before, but with all of that as kind of the backdrop, tell me about the new book, please.
Sure. By the way, you also helped edit the last edition, the third edition of Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, and the research work that you did on those other books was just spectacular. Um,
Thank you.
I'm sorry. The question was,
Well, I wanted to, if you wanted to talk about your
oh, the last American
the
president.
new book, because I think it all wraps into one here. I think what we're
Mhm.
looking at, if I'm understanding the book correctly, is this sort of, I don't like to use the phrase because it's entirely overused, but perfect storm of a person kind of created by this system, and then a system that has been so corrupted away from. I always look back at like the New Deal as the beginning of this kind of saga of the rise of oligarchy again in American history. And
Yeah,
so, am
that was
I correct
exactly
in
true.
suspecting that a lot of this is kind of your book is very timely?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, the first third of the book is kind of about how Trump grew up this very, very wounded young man, which is a common experience among people who end up as dictators. Hitler's biography is strikingly similar in some respects, Mussolini's as well. These basically abused children. His father was apparently a psychopath, or at the very least a sociopath, and his mother was she was a Scottish immigrant, and she was so horrified, apparently, by his behavior that every summer when he would come home from the military school that his father sent him to because he was so incorrigible and such a bully, she would go back to Scotland all by herself and spend the summer there. And so basically, he was raised with this tyrannical father who his niece, Mary Trump, has, claimed was mentally ill. And just badly wounded by that, never felt loved. And you can see that, in his craving for rallies and things. He's desperate for people to love him and, appreciate and honor him. And there's just never enough. He's just got this empty bucket. And no matter what you pour into it, it's just never enough. So that's the how the book starts, and it kind of set him up. And so then when his father died, he needed another mentor. He's not all that bright, although he is very cunning. And but he needed somebody to guide him. By the way, I personally I believe that for the last 8 years or 9 years now, that his mentor has been Vladimir Putin. But that's just a personal belief, and it's not in the book. But anyhow, he turned to Roy Cohn. He was introduced to Roy Cohn in New York City, and Roy kind of took him under his wing and taught him, the basic stuff. Never admit that you're wrong, always blame your accusers, and double down on it. And when you feel like you must be on defense, always go on offense, always attack, always relentlessly. And this has, it became his mantra in business. It's why he's been involved in over 3,000 lawsuits. It has become his mantra in politics as well. And so then in the middle third of the book, we get into how these right-wing billionaires created this massive right-wing infrastructure that's designed to basically reverse the New Deal. This was the counter-revolution against the New Deal that really began in a big way. I mean, it emerged first. Fred Koch jumped in and started funding the John Birch Society in 1954 as a result of the Brown versus Board decision, or shortly after that decision, 54. But it really and started building out these, in every single state. There's a state policy center. There's all these think tanks. The Cato Institute was originally the Charles Koch Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, all these other groups that were created, not just by the Koch brothers, but by this whole network of billionaires that they were part of, and some who
Right.
weren't part of it. And that network then during the Reagan years, when Reagan ended the Fairness Doctrine, started becoming a media network as well, where they started acquiring radio and television stations, and now they're acquiring television networks.
Which goes
So
back to Roger Ailes' idea back in the early 70s for GOP TV,
yeah,
which I
exactly.
learned
That
about
was
from you.
right. Ailes had pitched that to Richard Nixon, and Nixon couldn't do it, and then, so the plan B was to record VHS videotapes and
Right.
airmail them, or courier deliver them to TV stations, and that didn't work. And so, but Ailes finally got the money with Rupert Murdoch and made it happen. And I think it was '96 that Fox went on the air. So anyhow, the middle part of the book is about how this whole network was set up that was just kind of waiting for, a charismatic figure who would go along with tax cuts for billionaires, and
Right.
allowing monopoly again, and gutting unions, and knocking the American middle
Destroying
class.
public schools.
Right. Destroying the public school system, indebting college students so they would no longer protest on campuses. I mean, turning the healthcare industry into a major profit industry. Every step along the way, it was something that would benefit some billionaire, some group of billionaires, and basically screw the middle class. And when Reagan came into office, 2/3 of us were in the middle class, and at that time, the middle class was one single paycheck could support a family. You could buy a house, buy a car every couple of years, take a vacation, put your kids through school, and save for retirement. And now it's two. It takes two people to do that. And now, even with that two-person middle class, which we have now, 44 years later, you still see that the middle class has gone from 2/3 of us down to a little less than half of us. And that has provided the demagogues, essentially, the populists on the right, with an opportunity to say, look at that, you've been screwed. The deep state, the system, the black and brown people who took your job, the women who are in the job market who took your job,
Right.
they have screwed you, when in fact it was Reaganism. It was neoliberalism, Reagan's neoliberal policies, which were signed on to by a bunch of Democrats as well, Bill Clinton and,
Right.
and Barack Obama. But nonetheless, it's neoliberalism that destroyed them. I wrote another book just about that, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism. how Reaganism gutted America's middle class. So, and then the third of the book is how we push back, how America can fight back, how other countries have fought back against wannabe fascist dictators who have emerged within democracies. And there's some good news. Attempts to take over democracies by fascist wannabe dictators tend to be successful in very, very poor countries. They tend not to be so successful in very wealthy countries. And people say then, but weren't Germany and Italy very wealthy? And the answer is no, not after World War One.
Right.
They were devastated.
Right.
And so, it was that poverty, it was that destruction that allowed that to happen. So that's essentially the book. And I think people will find it parts of it shocking, informative, hopefully inspiring. It's a pretty straightforward analysis of, where we are and how we got here.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, and well, only partly because I've worked with you on so much of the research that kind of backs all of that. That it probably made this a much quicker book to write
Yeah,
than it would have been if you had to reinvent all of it.
indeed. Thank you for that.
It occurs to me recently that one of the things I think I'm what I think we're seeing here is kind of the unholy alliance that started with Reagan, with business and bigots and the anti-abortion crowd and all of this, the religious right, the Christian nationalists now. I mean, now they're just calling themselves that proudly.
Yeah.
I think my congressman has said as much. Riley Moore, that is. But it's this. It seems to me that Project 2025 is essentially the plan to undo the New Deal. Right.
Yeah.
That's what that
And the
blueprint
Great Society.
always was. Yeah. And the Great Society, correct. And it seems to me that then big business and libertarian types generally tend to want kind of unfettered immigration because make everyone race to the bottom, and they can then use the immigrants to say, this is why you're unhappy, and that's why you need to elect our preferred politicians who will give us the tax breaks and everything like this. And it seems like the concession from the libertarian side has been, okay, you can have mass deportations and concentration camps, and you can have the National Guard in our cities, and you can curb all of our rights in the Bill of Rights and all of this, as long as we can do all of the mergers that we wanted to do, as long as we can privatize all of the things that we want to privatize, as long as we can raise the retirement age on Social Security. So, right. And it seems to me that that's just kind of Trump is the perfect person to be that. But it also doesn't, I don't think I don't think if it hadn't been Trump, it would have been someone else. And going back to that first part of the book you were talking about, I was half joking and not really earlier this year when you saw Elon Musk and Donald Trump dismantle and working together hand in hand like brothers, dismantling every single thing and picking off the parts and divvying it up. That it's like, it's incredible that the two most powerful people in the world at that moment we wouldn't have to be dealing with them in this way if their fathers had just hugged them, once.
Yeah.
And it's only sort of funny, but it gets back to that the generational trauma of things. I guess the next question I would have for you, or the next thought I'd want to kind of get with you, is it seems to me that people are kind of waking up to the fact that you cannot have this sort of concentrated wealth. You cannot actually do the neoliberal program without starting a slippery slope very quickly into oligarchy, because of how economic power reinforces political power, especially with, starting back with Buckley v. Vallejo and all the way up to Citizens United today, that money is speech. And so the more money you have, the more political power you have. It seems to me people are starting to wake up to this. I've seen more people talk about the Telecommunications Act of 1996 than I have ever seen since, 10 years ago when we were talking about it. And that seems to me a good thing. And I think I know the answer to the question. You don't think it's too late, right? For
No,
this sort of, yeah,
no, I don't. No, I actually don't. What I do see is a bifurcation in America. The former Confederate states mostly. Um, well, let me back up. Capitalism typically works best for the very wealthy, for the capitalists, when there's an underclass, a more or less permanent
right.
underclass.
Right.
And you mentioned immigration. The deal that we had had since the Bracero program in 1956, Eisenhower's program, was that basically people from Mexico could be that underclass as long as they behaved themselves. And in fact, for years and years and years, I mean, for a century, every summer, every spring or summer, you'd have about 1 million Mexicans come north. And every fall after the picking season, you'd have about 1 million Mexicans go south. And Eisenhower tried to regularize that by giving people these cards that allowed them to be here for the picking season, called them braceros. Um, that didn't work out because employers then started using them as threats. You're not going to accept my stealing your wages, or you're not going to accept my raping your daughter. I'm going to pull your bracero card, and you're going to have to go back to Mexico. And so that kind of fell apart in the late 50s, and then it just became informal. Millions of people here without documentation. That was the underclass. The shift that has been being made over the last 15 years or so that has set up the possibility of getting rid of all these brown-skinned people in the permanent underclass is that the southern states, by freezing the minimum wage at $7.25 an hour, are creating a permanent white underclass.
Right.
And a white underclass that's easily manipulated, that can vote, Fox News and right-wing talk radio and whatnot, their job is to keep that underclass um, outraged against Black people and women and brown people, um,
Right.
and and in favor of tax breaks for billionaires, and monopoly is just fine. And the old Rush Limbaugh's joke, no poor person ever gave me a job, which is complete BS, by the way. I've started 5 companies, and I was poor when I started every single one of them, and I hired
Well, more
people.
than that, spending creates jobs, and
Yeah,
who
exactly.
has to spend all of their money is poor people.
All right. Yeah, 100% of their income goes out. Yes, absolutely. So, so I think that where we're at now is we're going through kind of a societal change and a change in the way capitalism is structured. That if this program continues, if ICE actually scales up to the size that it's now budgeted for, and becomes the largest police force maybe in the world. I don't know. Probably China has a larger one, but just simply because they have a larger population. But on a per capita basis, certainly one of the largest police forces in the world. Um, and they managed to purge America of the estimated 10 to 12 million people who are here without documentation. And by the way, the thing that I find uh, so funny, weird, and tragic is that it's becoming increasingly clear that Trump thinks that when people are applying for asylum, when they're called asylum seekers, that they're people who came from insane asylums. He constantly goes back to this. These Venezuelans who came from, they emptied their insane asylums. Look at all these asylum people here in the United States. And he doesn't understand what seeking asylum is. It's just like, ah. But anyhow, if they
I,
can succeed in getting these, 8, 10, 12 million people out of the country, and strip the green cards and the work permits and whatnot, as they're aggressively doing, of the Haitians and in Springfield and everybody else, then they're going to have their only option, if they want to continue to operate capitalism in the kind of classic fashion that requires a permanent underclass, is to create an oppressed white permanent underclass, which is what we had in the 1920s. It's what we
right.
had in the period from the Civil War to the 1920s, to the end of really until the 1930s, is you had a permanent white underclass of poor people who were easily exploited. They worked the mines, they worked the factories, they built the railroads. When they tried to import Chinese labor in the 1880s in order to have something even cheaper than the permanent white underclass, then the Supreme Court knocked that down. Uh, Actually, I think they initially said it was okay, but the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1886. But there were some attempts to replace it, but you didn't have a white middle class that white people could go to at that time. I mean, in the
Right.
census of 1900, only about 10% of us were in the middle class. By 1930, it was maybe 20% of us. So, so it looks to me like they're going to recreate the white underclass, the permanent white underclass, and that's going to be a tinderbox. That's going to be they're playing with fire. That's what brought about the New Deal. It's what brought about the Republican Great Depression. It's what it's what brought about the Union riots. It's what brought about Haymarket Square. Having a permanent white underclass. And so I think that we're probably going to go through a period over the next 4 or 5 years, maybe 10 years, where as the brown underclass starts to vanish from the United States and capitalism doesn't say, oh, gee, let's just have a middle
Right.
class and have the billionaires not be quite as rich. They're not willing to say that. And that's very clear. I mean, it's all the billionaire, you got 157 billionaire families who supported Trump's election and all that kind of thing. So when that happens, and if they can keep the minimum wage frozen and they can keep the unions out, as they are successfully doing in most of the Confederate states, you're going to see this huge bifurcation in America where the blue states say, we don't need a permanent white underclass in order to function. I mean, Seattle, when they raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, everybody was like, oh, it's going to be the end of the world. Well, what happened was all those, as you pointed out earlier, all those employees who had been making 725 are now making $15 an hour, didn't stop working, and the companies didn't go out of business.
Right.
They started buying things. They spent more money,
Right.
and they stimulated the economy, and Seattle's economy got better, and Washington State's economy got better. I mean, there's just no shortage of evidence of this. But you're never going to get the people who want a permanent underclass to acknowledge that, because it means that the billionaires in those states can't be quite as wealthy. And so
Right.
I think that we're heading down a road that we've seen before. It's been about 80 years, and you and I used to, we interviewed Neil Howe, and we used to talk about this when we were working together. That these 80-year
It's
cycles.
like half of the premise of the hidden history of American oligarchy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're about to see a reboot of the Republican Great Depression. And
Well,
I
and
expect it's probably going to start in a big way within the next 12 months.
I I see a lot of the same similarities you see, and I think, just to touch on Haymarket, for instance, who was blamed right after Haymarket? Oh, those dirty
The
Germans. They were the
anarchists.
immigrant class in the Eastern Europeans.
Yeah.
And if we can talk about the old Confederacy states, but I'm here in West Virginia, a state that was born out of struggle, out of leaving the Confederacy, where we have been one of the places that I think the Republicans learned early on the Democratic Party, and I am a Democratic partisan. I have lots of positions in our state party, but largely the National Party said we don't need those people anyway. And we are, they are fostering the permanent white underclass here. It's a state that's 92% white. There are definitely places where there is immigrant labor, and the immigrant labor is treated worse than the white labor. And this all goes back to the sort of strategy that we saw in the coal towns, where the coal companies literally hired people to go out into places after World War I, like Italy, like Germany, like Eastern Europe, and recruit the most desperate people to come to work in the mines to break up the unions.
Yep.
And then they kept them in different parts of town. So
Especially
that
the
if you were
Irish.
Irish, right? If you were Irish, you weren't necessarily associating with the Italians. They weren't encouraging the Italians to learn the English language necessarily, and they would bring different priests in at different times to make sure they weren't congregating in any of these places. And certainly everyone felt better than they weren't at the bottom of the railroad tracks where the black part of town was. But one of the things that eventually happens is that once you're in a coal mine, everybody is covered in black soot, and you're left with your red bandanas from the company store. And
Mhm.
those red bandanas, you can impose martial law and say more than three miners can't gather at a corner, but you can't stop people from putting on the bandana and just letting everyone know, hey, I'm one of the good guys, one of the union
Right.
guys. I'm
We're
fighting
talking
to
a
make
word.
sure
Yeah.
all of our scales are untipped, right? Which is why the UMWA became one of the first desegregated unions in the country down in the District 1, I want to say.
Mhm.
And so I'm heartened to see that you see the same things, or to hear that you see the same things. And there is this sort of problem of what how does this get resolved? And I don't expect you to have the answer on this, and we're short on time here, but I want to get your thought of, it seems to me that part of the problem is a Democratic Party, again, of which I am a member and which I'm proudly a member. And here in West Virginia, we have as part of our platform a 21st century economic bill of rights. But it seems like, and you see this with Zohran Mamdani, right? Where people are just are hesitant, it's vote blue no matter who until, ooh, that guy is talking a little bit about maybe undoing some of the stuff. And that's how I see it, at least, of like, we're 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 seeing real lights of pushback within the party. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure why the party isn't able to embrace it. And I mean, I know the answer. It's money in
Yeah, the
politics.
answer is that half the party's on the take.
Yeah.
And
So
and
I see people calling for let's break up into two parties and all of this,
no, that's crazy.
and
We need to
I
occupy the Democratic Party. We need a new Occupy movement. Progressives need to take over the party. This all, I
we need
mean,
a Tea Party
this,
movement for the left, right?
yeah, exactly. This all tracks back to 1976 and 1978 with the Buckley decision and the Bellotti decision, which said that money was speech and corporations were persons. And that enabled Reagan to just float into office in 1980 on a tsunami of oil money. And it's gotten progressively worse year after year. But because of that, because they basically allowed legalized political bribery when Bill Clinton was running for president in 1992, I mean, if you read his New Covenant speech, his stump speech, it was pure FDR. I mean, he campaigned as a solid progressive. And but what he realized, halfway through the campaign, or at some point anyway, was that there was no way he could raise enough money to compete with the big money that was on the Republican side, that was, uh, going against him, on George Herbert Walker Bush's side. And so basically he created this thing called the Third Way, the New Democrats, the New Democrat movement, which was, we're Democrats and we think that we should have a social democracy and a social safety net, but we're also very happy with capitalists and billionaires, and we're happy to take their money, and we're going to get a little squishy on monopoly, and
There are good
maybe,
billionaires, right?
right.
And I feel like that's come back to bite the party with now as
Oh, it's
all of
been
the Silicon
continuously
Valley
biting the party.
billionaires
Yeah,
jumped ship.
it's been continuously biting the billionaires and biting the party, and it's creating a war within the Democratic Party now. And now you've
Right.
got another group of people who are apparently being funded by big money, who are trying to create a think tank to teach Democrats how to be good neoliberals. Let's all go back to Clintonism. But basically, Clintonism and Bill Clinton, and then Hillary Clinton too, going after Bernie. If Bernie had been our candidate in 2016, Donald Trump wouldn't have gotten within a mile of the White House.
You know
And
who was talking about the problem of media consolidation back in 2015 on every major network that would have him on the debate was Senator Bernie Sanders.
exactly.
He was ringing that alarm bell a long time ago, and
Oh
it's a
yeah.
shame that it
Long
took this
before that,
pressure
I
on
mean,
Jimmy Fallon to.
yeah, Bernie started coming on my show every Friday in 2003, and he was talking about this stuff. I
Right.
mean, for 7 years, every Friday, or maybe it was 11 years, every Friday he was on my program, and for an hour taking calls from listeners. So
That's how I got my start in radio. Partially, it was a call screening for you
that's right. That's
and
right. You were our call screener, yeah, during Brunch with Bernie. So I had forgotten that. You really worked your way up through the hierarchy in our little business here. Um, so anyway, I think the bottom line is that the Democratic Party, one of the things that Obama brought, even though he still embraced neoliberalism and didn't push the party back to its FDR roots, like Biden tried to do, and Biden, I think, had a lot of success with this. By the way, Joe Biden was the first Democrat since Jimmy Carter who was embracing the New Deal.
if it
And
weren't for my
so,
state senator, my U.S. senator at the time, I think we could have gotten a lot. I don't think we would have Trump 2.0. I think we can.
yeah,
I'm not happy to, but I'm
yeah.
satisfied blaming Joe Manchin in large part for what was going on
Oh,
right now.
completely agree. Completely agree. So, what happened was, between 92 and 2020, 2020 really, you had a Democratic Party that had basically sold out, with all this patina of nobility, the kind of James Carville, oh yeah, we're doing the good thing, we're fighting we're here for the little guy, but we're okay with the billionaires, no problem. We'll keep their taxes low, and et cetera. And um, what's happened over the last 8 years, 9 years during the Trump era is, and that brought about Biden's conversion from a neoliberal to a genuine progressive, was that people have realized that neoliberalism, Reaganism, Clintonism have just totally screwed this country, at least screwed the white middle class. And not to mention everybody else, but primarily, that's where the power is in America right now, the political power, by and large. And while Trump was campaigning on that, saying that it was all the fault of brown people and women, um, within the Democratic Party, people were figuring it out, and realizing that Bernie was onto something. And so now you've got a Democratic Party that is about half progressive, which is moving in the right direction. I'd say that the Democratic Party now is probably where it was in 1931, 32, maybe 1930, certainly 1928, 29 before the Great Crash. That is like half progressive, seriously, genuinely progressive, and half basically on the take. And you've got some who are officially on the take. They call themselves problem solvers. We solve problems for corporations.
Right.
Half of them are Republicans, half of them are Democrats, and these guys are all taking
They're
as
solving the problem of how do we privatize Social Security without people
exactly,
knowing it.
exactly. So the Democratic Party has to have a reckoning, and this the 2028 primary is probably going to be it. And if the Democratic Party doesn't embrace progressivism, if it doesn't embrace its own damn roots, the New Deal and the Great
Right.
Society, if it doesn't go back to what worked, what built the American middle class, what literally created the middle class, the American middle class out of nothing, if the Democratic Party doesn't go back to that, it's screwed and America is screwed. And that's why it's so important that people do what you have been doing, Troy, since you left my employ, which is explicitly getting within the Democratic Party and taking the damn thing over. Waking people up, bringing progressives in, becoming a precinct committee person, or whatever position you can get within the Democratic Party. That's what progressives need to be doing right now, because there isn't an alternative. We're not going to create a third party. The libertarians don't want you. The Greens are a joke, largely funded by the GOP, but by the way, in most states. And and what's her name, shows up every 4 years, like a bad Halloween puppet or something, and
Yeah, Jill Stein.
talks to the Democrats for an election cycle and then goes away,
Yep.
presumably with a lot of money having fundraised. Jill Stein, and it's just so tragic and so disappointing. But it is what it is. So we've got to take over the Democratic Party and turn it into a progressive party, and then take back America and rebuild the American middle class. Now, you and I were talking about the 80-year cycles that Strauss and Howe talked about. Peter Turchin, and yeah, I don't have his book right here, but I've got one nearby. He's written a couple of books. Peter Turchin argues that it's not a 180-year cycle, that it's two 40-year cycles. That we go through
Hmm.
40 years
Yep.
of right-wingism, and then we go through 40 years of left-wingism, and then we switch back. And it's always, it's always a reactionary thing, the switch back.
Right.
And I think that we are very, very close to a reactionary switchback against the right. And Trump is actually making that easier every day with the excesses and demands and outrageous, Nazi-like, BS that he spouts. And so I'm actually, no matter how bad things seem, I'm actually quite optimistic. My biggest concern is that Trump will do what Hitler did or what dictators typically do in a big way, what Reagan did in a small way, Reagan and Bush, all three of them, which is have a war. When you get in trouble, have a
Right.
war. When the Marines were killed at the Beirut bombing, what did Reagan do? He pulled the Marines out of Beirut. He cut and run, and then he invaded Grenada. Let's have a little
Right.
war. Maggie Thatcher taught him that lesson with the Falklands when she got in trouble with the miners' union. And then
And
she,
we're certainly poking Venezuela right now.
well, it's looking like Venezuela, but also Trump just cut off Mark Rudd from, the head of NATO came over here back in July and cut a deal with Trump. Trump was not willing to sell weaponry directly to Ukraine. Apparently, that was
Right.
part of his kissing Putin's ass. I don't know what Putin has on him, but Putin clearly owns him. And so he said, I'm not going to sell them to Ukraine, but I'll sell them to you, and you can give your weapons to Ukraine. And
Right.
so that was the deal. And NATO's been doing that. The NATO nations have pretty much depleted their stockpile of Patriot missiles, the anti-missile defense systems that they could use to defend themselves against Russian aggression. And it's all in Ukraine now, and being used up very, very rapidly, by the way. And so now Trump is saying, I can't sell these back to you. I can't sell them to you to replenish your stocks. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it. And that, in my mind, sounds like he's setting up Europe to be attacked by Putin. So here's the scenario. Trump gets us into a war with Venezuela, which occupies us in our hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine
Right.
2.0. Putin attacks the Baltic states, and now he's in a non-nuclear war with NATO. Um, Xi looks at that and says, now's the time to act, and he takes Taiwan.
Right.
And Trump has already basically said he won't stop him from doing that. And then Netanyahu says, okay, cool. And he starts bombing Iran. And basically, you've got the entire world in flames. You've got a world war.
Right. You have World War
And
Three.
and now we're back to Strauss and Howe's fourth turning. A
Right.
war, a depression and a war, followed by a progressive reboot. So,
Right.
what saddens me about this, I think this is all likely, frankly, the scenario that I just laid out, this war scenario. And what saddens me about it is that, we could be making these transitions without war, and lots of people are going to die and be made miserable. I mean, look at what's going on in Gaza right now. Look at what's going on in
Right.
Ukraine right now. Look at what's going on in Venezuela right now, for that matter. And
Yeah, and I'll have to have you back on another time when you're available again. But I'll say it's the other thing that really disheartens me is this is all time we're not. War is one of the greatest drivers of climate change. You know, the amount of CO2 that goes off with every bomb, and all of the just the amount of everything that goes into war. And all of this is while we're not addressing this major pressing problem. And the Arctic is coming more and more into play as a geopolitical place because it's thawing. I do want
now
to
you've
say
got,
just a few things before I let you go is first of all, yeah, get involved. It is something we can all do. And especially in rural areas, there are vacancies. You don't even have to like fight with people. You just find out what isn't operating, what executive committee or precinct thing isn't going, and then get in touch with your state chair, and they will be more than happy to have an active chapter there rather, and even if it's progressive, it just doesn't matter.
yeah.
The other thing I think is that there is precisely one think tank that the Democrats need right now. It's in the think tank that's like the American Legislative Exchange Council, but working on all the legislation and executive action we need to get done to do a 21st century economic bill of rights, which I do believe is the antidote to the Project 2025. And it's very much what Democrats need to get on board with all the way to the top. And third, the book is The Last American President, A Broken Man, a Corrupt Party, and a World on the Brink. The guest has been Thom Hartmann. I really appreciate the time. I learned so much from you to this day, and I think we learn a lot from each other. So I appreciate the time. I hope you'll come back and join us again. And in the meantime, get out there, get active, tag you're it.
There you go. Well said, Troy. Thank you. Thanks for
I
having
heard
me.
that somewhere.
Yeah, thanks for
Thanks,
having
Tom.
me. Yeah, good talking to you.